Buenas tardes. Is it tardes or noches? Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Alvaro Huerta, and I'm a visiting scholar here at the Chicano Studies Research Center. So I would like to thank everybody for attending this event. And also I'd like to thank Dr. Joe Noriega for allowing me to give this talk, in addition to Dr. Rebecca Epstein for organizing this event. And I would also like to thank Dr. Juan Gómez-Quiñones for writing the foreword to this book. He's been a mentor, a friend, and a colleague of mine for many years. And also, speaking of mentors, I'd like to thank Dr. Abel Valenzuela for supporting my academic trajectory since I've been here as a freshman and a master's student at UCLA. So for me, being here and writing this book, it's something that is very important, not just for my own personal benefit, but to give me an opportunity to speak about something that's very topical and very timely in this country, and that is the question of immigration. And it is something, as you all know, has been stalled in Congress, but remains a problem for the estimated 11 million undocumented immigrants in this country. Just recently, we had 8 congressmen arrested over this issue, and the Dreamers have been fighting from day one to try to make an impact in terms of reform in this country, to make a difference. And as I've stated, I am a visiting scholar. I received my PhD from Berkeley, my master's from UCLA, and bachelor's from UCLA. But that is not really who I am. That is what I do, is I do research. According to Marx, we need to differentiate people in terms of who they are and what they do. And in the same fashion, immigrants are not janitors. They're not gardeners. They're not maids. That is what they do. But that is not who they are. They are human beings. They are dreamers. They love the Dodgers. They were applauding like I was when Uribe hit a home run. They are job creators, entrepreneurs. They build homes like my mother did in Tijuana. They are driven, highly driven. They are a self-selected group. For people to leave their town in Guatemala to come to this country, to cross 2 borders, it takes a lot of drive. It takes a lot of initiative. And you need to be fearless. Because as we know, every year, hundreds of immigrants die in the borders of Arizona, in the deserts of Arizona. A few years ago, over 444 immigrants were found to be dead in the deserts of Arizona. And those are the ones that we know of. And we know that when people cross the border, especially for women, there's a high risk of rape, of assault. And now, with the rise of the gangs and the narcos, and in Mexico in particular, we see that there's a high rate of kidnapping and extortion, where typically in the 1970s, you had human smugglers, also known as coyotes, would cross people over, charge them $500, either in advance or once they arrived here. And that was it. It was a clean relationship. It was more like a mom and pop shop. And there was a level of trust found in the communities where there was a relationship between the Mexican, the Guatemalan, the Salvadoran who wanted to cross over and had a relationship with the coyote. in terms of a referral through their migrant ties, through their migrant relationships, where there was trust in terms of crossing people over. That is not the case anymore. So when conservatives talk about immigration and immigrants and talk about the cost, for me, in this book and in my teachings here at UCLA and elsewhere, what I ask, what about the cost for the immigrants themselves? What about the high cost for those that have to abandon their families, to abandon their ranchos, to abandon their cities? And what about the high cost of those that, when they get here and they have family members that are ill, that they cannot return to visit their mother in their final days, that they cannot return to help their father when he has Alzheimer's? So the costs are higher for the immigrants than anybody else, because they bear those costs, and their family members bear those costs. When my father came to this country during the Bracero program, he left my mother and my older sisters for many years, sending remittances back. So there were costs there as well. So when we talk about costs and benefits of immigration, for me, statistics are important, but in this particular book, what I want to talk about is the human aspect of it. So add a human face to it, to humanize the immigration debate, to talk about dignity and respect, to talk about people, to talk about human beings, and talk about their lives. To talk about my mother, who spent 40 years in this country cleaning homes for the middle class. And for my father, who spent 10 years, 20 years as a farm worker, and another 10, 20 years as a janitor. And as we all know, any rational parent will tell you, be they immigrant or citizen, there's one thing that's fundamental and universal among rational parents, is that they sacrifice themselves. And this is particular for immigrants in this country, whether they're Asians, Latinos, from Africa, or anywhere in the world that come to this country, that they sacrifice themselves and their bodies and their labor and everything that comes with it for the benefit of their children. It is for them that they do these jobs. It is for them that they do what sociologists refer to as immigrant jobs, as dirty jobs. But for the immigrant, there's no such thing as a dirty job. There's no such thing as an immigrant job. Because in any and every type of honest work, there's dignity. And to them, they don't see it that way. The immigrant does not view being a gardener as a disgrace, being a day laborer as a disgrace. They do not see it that way. Whether they're cleaning our restrooms or whether they're parking our cars, to them, they are supporting themselves here. They're doing it for their children, and they're doing it for people from their hometowns via remittances. And for this sacrifice, what do they get? What kind of treatment do they get? They are referred to pejorative terms from the mainstream, in particular in conservatives, Republicans. While Mitt Romney was talking about Mexicans should self-deport themselves, he had Guatemalan immigrants that lacked status in this country working his yards. So on the one hand, they are easy to condemn. They are easy to categorize us, our parents, immigrants, as social burdens, but on the other hand, they depend on the immigrant labor. They depend on the immigrant for their yards, to take care of their children, to clean their homes. When they go to the cleaners, an immigrant is dry cleaning their clothes. When they go to the restaurant, an immigrant is washing those dishes and cleaning the tables. If you're into high fashion, if you go to New York and Los Angeles, which are the two of the capitals of high fashion in this country, you will see that it's immigrant labor that produces high fashion, because high fashion is a finicky industry, and there's a high turnaround, so you can't import it from China or elsewhere. It's done here. But those are Guatemalans, those are Salvadorians, those are Hondureños, those are Mexicans that toil for hours, bent over, making these clothes that are being sold at high prices while they are getting low prices. And oftentimes, they don't even receive the minimum wage. But yet they're the problem to America's ills, according to conservatives. The linguist George Lakoff talks about frames and how conservatives have been more effective in framing the argument against immigration, against welfare reform, against all these social programs that we depend on than progressives and liberals. And by frames, he refers to mental structures in our minds that help us understand arguments. So for those of you who grew up poor like I did, and on welfare, conservatives will make us believe that we're the problem, that welfare is a problem and needs to be gotten rid of, because it creates dependency, because it creates so-called lazy people that there's no incentive for them to work. But yet, when we subsidize corporations or agribusiness, isn't that welfare as well? So how is it that welfare is bad in one sense in terms of working people, poor people, but yet it's good in terms of helping corporations thrive in this country or evade taxes while they're making billions of dollars? So the conservatives have been very effective over the years, over the past 30, 40 years, in creating institutions like the Heritage Foundation, American Enterprise Institute, and others, to create policies and frameworks and arguments that push public policy in a certain direction in this country. And the progressives, the liberals, the Democrats have been very ineffective in responding to those arguments. Even when we look at Social Security and all these different programs, oftentimes they're referred to as entitlement programs. And as we know, entitlement has a connotation of something that is bad, where a kid, for example, he is an entitled kid, he is spoiled. If he doesn't get his iPad or he doesn't get his iPhone 5S, then he has a pout and because he's entitled and he's spoiled and so on and so forth. So these programs, instead of being defended as basic human rights and issues in terms of housing and safety nets and healthcare and everything that comes with it, Democrats and progressives have done a terrible job in countering the arguments, the frameworks that the conservatives have been engaged in for decades. So you hear President Obama, for example, talk about immigration reform earlier this year, and he talks about that we should enforce our border, that immigrants should pay back taxes, that they should pay a fine, that they should get in the back of the line. So in this book, and when I argue, and when I read, and when I study, and when I talk to my students, I tell them, why should they pay a fine? Why should they pay back taxes when they are owed salaries, when their wages are being stolen, when they're paying into the system in terms of Social Security and Medicare, but because of the Welfare Reform Act by Clinton, immigrants are not allowed to tap into that system. In other words, immigrants give more to the system than they take out. So when they're being taxed, they're paying into the system, but yet when it comes to the time where they need to collect on it, they cannot collect on it because they're undocumented. So if immigrants are to pay these fees and fines and get in the back of the line, which there really isn't no line to begin with, then shouldn't they also receive these benefits as well? So for me, this is what drives this book. These arguments, these contradictions that are argued by both Democrats and Republicans. When we talk about borders, for example, Reagan argued that the Berlin Wall should be taken down, and it was taken down. He argued for that. The icon of the conservatives. But now, what do we want in our borders? So on the one hand, the conservatives, the Republicans argue for borders, for no borders in Germany, but for a border in the US-Mexican border that is akin to the one in now South and North Korea. So when we talk about borders and labor, it's fine to have restrictions on labor, and it's fine to penalize labor for wanting to cross the border, but when it comes to capital, Republicans and conservatives are the first ones that argue for free trade, that want capital to roam the world without any restrictions, or with minimum restrictions, with NAFTA and other free trade agreements. So these are contradictions. So on the one hand, conservatives want capital to be able to go to other countries with limited restrictions, but when it comes to labor, they want severe restrictions. Michael Deere, a professor from UC Berkeley, has an excellent book out where he argues against the border. And he's actually arguing that the United States should tear down the border, just like President Reagan did. That the border, that we live in a country where borders are obstacles. And with the internet and technology, and in a society, in a world where everybody's more connected than ever before, why do we need a border? Why do we need to impede labor and over commerce? So these are very important arguments that do not take place in this country, because the conservatives have been very effective in limiting the argument in terms of immigrants being a social burden, being so-called illegal immigrants, being the problem to America's woes. And in this book, I write about these things. And I argue that we should move away from these arguments and move towards an argument of looking at every human being with dignity and respect, regardless of their legal status. And understanding that there is a cause and effect for everything that we do. The Bracero program, for example, the US-Mexican labor agreement of the mid-1900s allowed for migration for Mexicans to come to this country temporarily. And as a result, many Mexicans were exposed to the conditions here, and later on, they were able to come back and settle here permanently. The war in Vietnam, another example, where the United States was involved in, allowed for Vietnamese to migrate to this country. During the 1980s, the United States was involved immensely in Central America, supporting brutal regimes, which allowed for hundreds of thousands of Central Americans to come to this country. So these push and pull factors, these are all connected in terms of what causes migration. So people do not just migrate because of economics. They migrate because of war. They migrate because of famine. They migrate because of despair. They migrate because of spousal abuse. So when people come here, we need to see the connections. And the policies that the United States implements has a lot to do with the migration that we find today in terms of the American addiction to cheap labor. This is something that is very clear. And this is something that needs to be made central in the argument of immigration reform. So when we talk about immigration reform, we need to be careful of what we're asking for. Without humane immigration reform, we may get something that we don't want. And this is something that is very important to the argument. So in this book, it's a foreword by Professor Juan Gómez-Quiñones, a historian, also a poet. He has a great book out on the question of the indigenous people of this country that everyone should purchase. So we have a 2-for-1 deal. We buy my book, you know. Get his also. And the photographs by the Mexican photographer Antonio Turok. He's a brilliant photographer. He was the first photographer that took pictures of the Zapatistas when they first came out in January 1st, 1994. And before that, he was key in documenting the people of Chiapas, indigenous people of Chiapas, for many years, you know, before the rebellion. When I took a class from Juan Gómez-Quiñones, I learned about a brilliant man, Ricardo Flores Magón. In this country, we all know of Zapata, we all know of Pancho Villa, you know, but few of us know of Ricardo Flores Magón. He was the precursor to the Mexican Revolution. He was fighting against Diaz, you know, before Zapata, before Villa. And he was a brilliant writer, like Gómez-Quiñones. His essays are brilliant. He had relationships, political relationships with the IWW, the Wobblies, and others in this country. And eventually he was imprisoned in the United States, and he died in prison. So in this quote, he talks about the question of the dreamer. So the dreamer is the designer of tomorrow. Suppress the dreamer, and the world will deteriorate towards barbarism. For me, this book is for, apart from my wife, Antonia, who supported me through my doctoral studies and put up with my bad jokes. I write this book for the dreamers, for the undocumented youth, for the undocumented and unafraid, because it is they who are the civil rights leaders of today. It is they who have showed courage to speak up for themselves and for their families. For when I write and I speak about politics in a certain manner, I am protected because I am a U.S. citizen. What's the worst that the country can do to me? Deport me to East LA? But the costs are great for the undocumented youth. During the early 1960s, there were the Freedom Riders. These Freedom Riders were blacks and whites that traveled to the South, challenged Jim Crow. They challenged the segregation policies on the buses, and they traveled to show that the laws were inhumane and people died and people went to prison. And it was the youth, it was the young people, and these are the leaders. Like Abby Hoffman said, you know, do not trust anybody over 30. Thank goodness I'm 29. You can trust me. So these are the beautiful people that I find, I take courage from, that I look up to. They are my heroes. You know, the young people, the 9 people that crossed the border and came back knowing that they were going to get arrested and detained. I mean, these are beautiful people. They have a lot of courage. They are the ones that are saying, we want humane immigration reform. We will not accept a DREAM Act that only benefits us and it doesn't benefit our parents. Because Republicans and conservatives and Democrats are falling into this trap, are arguing that there are 2 types of undocumented immigrants. The deserving ones and the undeserving ones. So the deserving ones are the youth because at no fault of their own, they're here. But the parents are the sinners, they are the criminals, they are the ones that should be punished for their sins. Because they came to this country without legal status. And it is this dichotomy that we need to be careful for. And it is the undocumented youth, they are the ones that are saying, if my parents don't get their legal status, then I don't want my legal status because we are a family. But apparently for the conservatives in this country, the concept of the family, which they cherish, family values, don't apply to brown people. Conservatives argue against abortion, for example. But when brown children are born in this country with their parents lack legal status in Alabama, the state wants to pass laws that check their legal status when they're in elementary school. So these values that they argue for don't apply to brown girls and boys. The values that I argue for in this book are based on treating both children and adults with dignity and with respect. And the parents acted as rational beings to sacrifice and cross the border and take all the risks so that their children will have better opportunities. And this is the story. And these are the stories that we need to write about. We can talk about statistics and we can talk about the numbers, but at the end of the day, it's about stories, it's about people, it's about human beings. It's about people standing up and saying, my mother was deported. And when Obama talks about immigration, and he talks about comprehensive immigration reform, we need to remind him that he deported 1.6 million people in his first term, more than George Bush. And that is not a just policy. That is not a humane policy. And the Democrats' argument that they're going after violent offenders is not true. That is not true. Research shows that immigrants commit less crimes than American citizens. And if we are to compare the crime rate, then we need to do apples for apples. Because immigrants are younger. Of all people, Ron Unz did a great study on this. Because immigrants are younger, tend to be younger, then we need to compare them to American youth in terms of looking at statistics in terms of crime rate. So even doing it at that level, we find that immigrants commit less crimes. And it makes sense, because the costs are higher for them. So if I commit a crime, I may get probation, but if I was undocumented, I'm going to get deported. So the penalties are more severe. So this is very important in terms of what is the status, what is the story. And for us, with PhDs and positions, and we need to really look at the youth, because they're the ones that are telling us the stories. They are the ones that are leading us, and they are, for me, my role models in terms of guiding this dialogue, in terms of pushing the argument and the policy. And we may all not agree. I personally don't agree, and I wouldn't want my son to cross the border the way they did. But they're taking their future in their own hands. And this is something that needs to be cherished and valued. And this is the example that we need, for all Americans. Because at the end of the day, it's an American story. And it's an American story that needs to be reframed. Reframed in a positive manner. Reframed in looking at what do immigrants bring to this country. If you look at Asian immigrants, for example, they have a high tendency, to favor the family, just like Latinos. They have larger families. And a lot of this has to do with coming from underdeveloped countries where you depend on large families because they're your social security, and you have to work the land. And as people get more urbanized, they have less children. But the fact of the matter is that when immigrants come to this country, they bring these strong values that America and Americans can learn from, about how immigrants cherish the family and how they depend on the family. The reason why you don't see 11 million undocumented immigrants on Skid Row is because they do not depend on the state. They depend on the family. And we can go around here and anybody, whether it's yourselves or your parents or your grandparents and your cousins, and there is a story of one day you woke up and your cousin was sitting right next to you. They're sleeping on the floor and you were sleeping right there. That one day a family came in and took that person in. And this is the value of migrant networks, where the networks serve as the state. They provide valuable services to each other. They give each other, through these migrant networks, immigrants, the newcomers, receive housing, receive loans that they don't have to pay back often, receive shelter, receive job referrals. So these are valuable assets that immigrants come bring to this country and contribute and make it, better. But yet those values, those networks are looked down upon. They are not cherished. And it's incumbent on people in this room, I believe, people that are privileged to have an affiliation with UCLA, one of the best universities in the world. I think we're number 12. And then our UCLA football team, I don't know what's better. That we have a more responsibility for those of us who are privileged to speak out for the los de abajo, those on the bottom. Like Peter Parker said, like his uncle told Peter Parker, he said, with great power comes great responsibility. Well, I say with great privilege comes great responsibility. And those of us who are privileged, who are educated, have a responsibility to give back to the community, to speak up for those that cannot speak for themselves because of everything that I talked about, because of the high cost. Because they didn't have the opportunities that we did. The pause is not for dramatic effect. This I think is very important. I have there's 8 children in my family, and 3 older sisters. They at 13, they came to this country to work as domestic workers. So that the younger siblings can get ahead in life. So that I can go to UCLA as a freshman. So my brother, Alvaro Huerta, the brilliant painter, can exhibit in Italy and Germany, New York. And they sacrificed their education. It's not like they had a choice, my father told them to. But they, as older sisters living in Tijuana at the time, were sent to this country to work as domestic workers. So for me, this is not an academic book per se, it's also a personal book. It's a question of human beings and what they sacrificed and what they did so that people like myself can get ahead in life. And in a way, this is my way of being reciprocal and my way of paying back my sisters. is to set time aside for my own studies, from the Dodger games, to write about and speak up, for immigrants like them that didn't have the same opportunities that I did, growing up. And to argue and counter-argue against bullies in this country that lack basic manners about how to treat others, about how to treat people with dignity and with respect. And if you're gonna pick on somebody, pick on somebody that can fight back. Pick on somebody that went to your universities, that read your books, that speaks your language. Because when we talk about immigrants, you're talking about human beings. You're talking about men and women that work in the fields so that we can have Caesar salads at a cheap rate. We're talking about men and women that clean our libraries and the student store and our classrooms at 2 in the morning while we're asleep, or on Facebook, or pretending to work on our final paper when it's due at 8 in the morning. And so while we rest and while we read, and there's other people that often we don't see because they're here at night, they're serving us behind these walls, and their labor allows us to do research. Their labor allows us to study. For those of you whose parents are immigrants, they sacrifice so you can be at UCLA, one of the best universities in the world. This is what I'm talking about. This is what I'm arguing in this book, and this is what I dedicated my life to, at the cost of my own professional career. And when I think about these things, it does affect me because it comes to the family. And I think about, women like my mother who worked 40 years as a domestic worker, taking care of other children, other people's children, and she doesn't even recognize, her own children. Or her house is in disarray because she's worried about her getting the next client and the next client and the next client. And no wonder her younger son, is in gangs. Because they're sacrificing, they're working, and they don't have that privilege of being there for their children. And while the middle class has the luxury of time and has the privilege to enjoy these benefits, it's only because they're able to hire domestic work. It liberates them from domestic work so they can pursue entrepreneurial activities, so they can enjoy a game of golf, so they can pursue other activities at very minimal cost. And so my story is not the story of the academic, it's the story of people like Maria, who is 64 years old and her son's an alcoholic and she doesn't have any Social Security and she can't retire, because she's undocumented. And this is their story. This is what is important to me, and the story is in the tradition of oral stories. It's in the tradition of writing about people's lives, and how by learning about other people we can learn about our own experience. And this is the story that I have to say and that I have to tell today. So these pictures are from Antonio Turok. So, this is like George Lakoff, it's a short book, and it's short stories, nonfiction, based on research conducted over the past several years. So this one essay is titled that we need humane immigration reform. So I wrote this in 2013. So the time has arrived for President Obama and Congress to take immediate action on comprehensive humane immigration reform. By immigration reform, I am not talking about militarizing our borders, empowering employers to behave as immigration enforcement officials, and imposing fines and back taxes on aspiring citizens. Instead, I am talking about allowing labor to cross our borders as transnational capital does, preventing employers from exploiting immigrant laborers, and lowering application costs for future citizens. Too often, when Democratic and Republican leaders speak about comprehensive immigration reform, their message mainly centers on enforcement-dominant policies. For instance, while Obama eloquently spoke about immigrants in the second inaugural address, his administration has deported more immigrants than that of his predecessor, President Bush, during the same time period. As the Obama administration continues to separate hardworking immigrants from their families and friends, I find it hard to believe when the president says, "Our journey is not complete until we find a better way to welcome the striving, hopeful immigrants who still see America as a land of opportunity." I don't find that the deportation of more than 1 million undocumented immigrants during Obama's first term in office as welcoming. Moreover, given that Republican leaders remain hostile and pay only lip service to Latinos and immigrants in this country, it's incumbent on Obama and the Democratic leaders to invest in the necessary capital for the benefit of the estimated 11 million undocumented immigrants in this country. Instead of dehumanizing and blaming immigrants for America's woes like the GOP, Obama and the Democratic leaders should demand that Latino immigrants be treated with dignity, respect, and tolerance. More specifically, Democratic leaders should educate and convince the public about the pivotal role undocumented immigrants play in America's social and economic prosperity, highlighting key characteristics like their willingness to sacrifice for their families, a strong work ethic, and an entrepreneurial bent. In developing a humane immigration reform policy, both Democrats and Republicans should learn from past immigration policies with progressive elements. This includes the Immigration Act of 1965, where immigrants from Latin America, Asia, and Africa benefited from family reunification components of this law. This also includes the Immigration Reform and Control Act of 1986, commonly referred to as IRCA, where almost 3 million immigrants qualified for amnesty. Republican leaders should learn from their iconic figure, President Reagan, who signed this legislation into law. Instead of doing what's right in both moral and economic terms by proposing another amnesty plan, a recent bipartisan group of senators, also known as the Senate Gang of Eight, introduced a regressive, comprehensive immigration reform proposal. It includes a so-called path to citizenship for qualified undocumented immigrants. But it mainly focuses on punitive measures such as secured border prerequisites before granting citizenship, imposing fines and back taxes, deputizing employers to behave more as immigration enforcement officials, and creating an exploitable labor pool of guest workers, like the Bracero program of the mid-1920s or 1950s. In short, only a humane and simple plan for the estimated 11 million undocumented immigrants in this country, and that's amnesty. Let's get over the hostility to the term and welcome the people who have been working in the shadows. This other essay, I wrote it in 2020, no, 2010. 2020. I'm like Nostradamus here. In 2020. It's titled, "I Ain't No Anchor Baby." I'm the I'm the son of Mexican immigrants, but I ain't no anchor baby. My late father, Salomon Chavez Huerta Sr., first immigrated to this country during the 1950s via the Bracero program, in which more than 4.6 million rural Mexicans performed desperately needed agricultural work in this country. He worked long hours, 6 days a week, for little pay and under terrible conditions. Later, as a legal permanent resident, he performed factory work for decades at sub-minimum wage. Meanwhile, my late mother, Carmen Mejia Huerta, originally came to this country during the 1960s, securing employment as a house worker for mostly white middle-class families. Lacking formal education like my father, she worked as a domestic worker for more than 40 years. This did not stop her, however, as a naturalized citizen, from seeking more clients in her twilight years. Currently, Republican leaders like Senator Majority Leader Mitch McConnell and Senator Lindsey Graham are making a big fuss about US-born children of undocumented immigrants. They're calling for a change in the 14th Amendment of the Constitution, which stipulates that persons born in the United States are citizens. According to Graham, undocumented immigrants come to this country simply to drop a child, or what he pejoratively refers to as drop and leave. Republicans don't practice what they preach. While they endlessly talk about family values and the sanctity of the unborn child, when it comes to Latino immigrants, they defame the family unit and attack brown children. Republican leaders are consciously instilling fear in the American public by scapegoating Latinos, both documented and undocumented, in this country. Let's not forget that the controversial Arizona law, SB 1070, now upheld in the court, required police to hold anyone they suspected here illegally, which meant all brown people. Responding to the Republican anti-immigrant agenda, Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid properly questioned how any person of Latino heritage could be a Republican. Reid should be applauded for calling out Latino Republicans for belonging to a party that is hostile to them. Instead of dealing with appalling unemployment figures, high home closure rates, and lack of credit for small businesses, Republicans are targeting the most vulnerable population in this country, undocumented immigrants. By doing so, they are no different than schoolyard bullies. Didn't they learn basic manners, such as treating others with dignity and respect? I certainly learned these manners from my parents. My parents taught my siblings and me to be good and generous to others. They also encouraged us to pursue higher education so that we don't experience the same hardships they faced both in Mexico and in this country. My late parents came to this country to seek work and better life for themselves and their family. They sacrificed themselves toiling in backbreaking, low-wage, dead-end jobs so that their children could pursue better opportunities not available to them in their homeland. Instead of praising them for their sacrifice and hard work, Republicans continue to bash and tarnish the memory of my late parents and the millions of others like them in this country. This is shameful. So I'll just read one more and then we're gonna turn it over to Professor Quiñones. So this essay I wrote in 2011, and it's titled Alabama's Racist Immigration Law, From Jim Crow to Juan Crow. When it comes to scapegoating immigrants for America's woes, the Deep South takes the cake. From slavery to Jim Crow, which is legalized segregation, to the recent waves of anti-immigrant rhetoric and policies, the South has taken the lead once again in passing the harshest racist laws against los de abajo, those on the bottom. Not wanting to be outdone by other xenophobic states such as Arizona, Utah, Indiana, and Georgia, Alabama Governor Robert Bentley signed HB 56 into law on June 6, 2011. This draconian law targets undocumented immigrants in numerous areas such as public benefits, employment, housing, public education, and law enforcement. It also promotes racial profiling against all Latinos without legal status in this country, with or without legal status in this country. Since the law requires that police officers inquire into the citizenship status of all individuals under the guise of reasonable suspicion, it doesn't take a scientific study to predict that those likely to be targeted will be brown-skinned individuals. In addition to making police officers take on the role of immigration agents, or la migra, as Mexican immigrants fondly refer to them, HB 56 also transforms teachers and school children officials into feared immigration agents by requesting them to check the legal status of all K-12 children. If instilling fear onto innocent Spanish-speaking children isn't cruel and unusual punishment, I don't know what is. There are other racist elements to this law. For instance, a U.S. citizen can be arrested for so-called harboring an undocumented immigrant by simply having him or her over for a family celebration. Landlords will also be legally liable for renting to someone who lacks legal status in this country, prompting landowners to avoid renting to anyone named Jose, Jesus, or Maria. In addition, single mothers or elderly can run afoul of the law by simply hiring a day laborer from the street corner or home improvement centers like Home Depot for moving heavy furniture or clearing dangerous brush from the front yard that may cause fires. For those of us who believe in equality and social justice for all individuals, especially the most vulnerable among us, we need to reframe the issue of immigration as a human rights issue. If we limit the national debate on immigration reform, for instance, as a false dichotomy between law-abiding citizens versus law-breaking immigrants, then those who advocate for fear and hate win. The anti-immigration leaders in this country, especially the Republican leaders who are spearheading these xenophobic efforts, constantly preach about freedom, liberty, and justice for all. They especially warn us about government intrusion into our lives. Don't these principles also apply to Latinos who will also be the victims of big government in the form of immigration laws that promote racial profiling? While I can understand that many Americans face uncertain and fearful times in the Great Recession, however, I find it unacceptable for them to constantly blame undocumented immigrants for America's economic downfall. Like the previous millions of Europeans who abandoned their homelands due to religious persecution, war, and economic upheaval in their home countries, so too do these newcomers from Latin America and beyond arrive in this country to seek better opportunities for themselves and their families. It's clear that American leaders, Republican leaders, know that these draconian laws such as Arizona's SB 1070 and Alabama's HB 56 will be contested in the courts on constitutional grounds. They are well aware that the federal government, not the states, has jurisdiction over immigration. Why then do they pursue a state-by-state anti-immigration law strategy? Simply put, Republican leaders are counting that these state laws will inevitably go to the conservative-dominated Supreme Court with the hope of legalizing xenophobia in this country. At the end of the day, if the Republican leaders inevitably prevail at the Supreme Court, it will not be the first time that the highest court of the land ruled in favor of legalized racism, as we can clearly see in the cases of slavery in Jim Crow era, where racial segregation prevailed for many years throughout the American neighborhoods. Public schools, public places, transportation, military business, and so on. If the majority of Americans don't act now and demand that their elected officials seek humane immigration policy throughout this country, we should not be surprised if Juan Crow soon replaces the odious Jim Crow. So these pictures Turok took while he was a visiting professor at the University of Notre Dame. So he took in Indiana and then he traveled to Los Angeles. And these pictures are free when you purchase the book. So another discount. me da hambre. That's my parents there. Handsome lad, if I must say so. They look like movie actors. There's a brilliant painting by my brother Salomon Huerta, and he actually painted this when he was younger in his career, just starting off. But what I love about it is it shows. It's not in the book, but the reason I end with this, it shows the dignity, of the indigenous person, referred to as the Indian, as somebody who's just doesn't have his head down. He's not bowing down to anybody. And the indigenous peoples of the Americas, from the Incas to the Aztecs to the Maya, have built great civilizations similar to those, not better than the Greek civilizations. And this shows, that equality, in a way, because this was bigger than the other one, shows their superiority. But the point is that, and my argument is that immigrants should not be ashamed of who they are. The children, like I was once, ashamed of my parents, should not be ashamed of who they are and who their parents are, because their parents, the indigenous people of this country, of this continent, deserve to be treated with dignity and respect. Thank you very much.
Dr. Huerta was both broad and deep in his presentation. The presentation, of course, alludes to the book, and the value of the book to me, and hopefully to others, including yourself, is that it is a very clear message about the fact that when we talk about immigration and we talk about immigrants, we're talking about people who have rights, complete rights, and who are basically tossed and twisted according to the winds of politics, the winds of the economy. And he tells us, alto, let's think about the humanness involved, and that if we don't agree and concede and construct humane treatment, where are we? One answer to the question of where are we is that it will make things worse, certainly not better, and they certainly won't stay the same. They will worsen. Alvaro is able to come across with the humaneness, one, because of the person that he is, and we could examine that personhood in various ways, or at least that I can recall in my mind. One, he is a thoroughly trained social scientist who has looked at urban issues, demographic realities, economic trends. He has been both here at UCLA and at Berkeley. He combines the language of the social scientist with a clear inclination or privileging in his interpretive bent of public policy. That is, if there are issues, if there are errors, then surely we should, by the same logic of their existence, ask that there be remedies. And if human beings create problems, I want to come back to that. If human beings create problems, they certainly can create solutions. And when anybody tells you that problems are insoluble, then you know that they are in fact harking and huckstering for the status quo. Alvaro brings to that policy orientation and that social science foundation aspects of his own life, for sure. And that very well may be the most compelling part of the book, something that transcends either the policy paper or the knowledgeable ad hoc piece. It is his own human background. And we can channel it in several ways, especially somebody like me who is as old as I am, because I actually recall Alvaro as an undergraduate, a very hardworking undergraduate. And the fact that he and Elsa and Antonio, he's presently married, and Adrian Alvarez, amongst others that I know, formed the first co-group of students whose proposal was to raise the issue of immigration and to raise the issue of the presence of undocumented students and what they should be provided with and encouraged and protected. This is something that is ongoing right now. That's why we can make reference to Dreamers. We can make references to sessions sponsored by, whether it's Chicano Studies or the Labor Center and so forth, and where they provide special attention, at least in the classroom, to undocumented students. But I recall that Alvaro was amongst those, which of course, the administration being what it was then, an administration that never once made amends of the fact that there was blatant public racism of an anti-Mexican portrayal on a regular basis. While on the other hand, when a new chancellor or chancellors came along, the slightest suggestion of anti-Asian American was immediately stopped and denounced. But in those days, anti-racism was a commodity that students had to pay a heavy price for, and Alvaro, Adrian, Elsa, and Antonio engaged in that. And they engaged in the first, that I know of, hunger strike on campus, over here for a while, then moving later. There had been an earlier Pro-Chicano Studies hunger strike at University Hall, the headquarters for the UC system back in about '69, I believe. But this one here at UCLA was the first. And I remember the chancellor going by and making some feeble jokes. His jokes were not. Yours are very good. And of course, doing nothing. Napolitano being gracious enough to offer to talk to students. He was gracious enough to go by and chuckle. Of course, he wasn't the one that was on hunger strike, as you can tell by photographs of him. Alvaro did something else, of course, that was pioneering, and probably some of you might have heard of it, and that was taking on an organizing task that the professional organizers, even the ones that are not college-based, the ones that come from the Industrial Areas Foundation cult of organizing, you don't only organize the impossible, you do the very specific with the very strong, almost unanimous possibilities of achieving it. That's the way you organize. Don't take on broad reform, fight for a street light. Alvaro and his colleagues set out to organize Latino gardeners. Probably everybody in this room here, since we're in Los Angeles, Southern California, know how ubiquitous gardeners are. And the fact that for the most part they get poor wages, are mistreated, they have no persona. Politicians won't talk to them, and when they tried, it was proven they won't talk. Organizing the Latino Gardeners Association. Putting together, across the county and beyond the county, Latino gardeners so that they could expect some fair treatment, to stop being mistreated by the authorities, which is what happens if they load up their truck, if they drive their truck to the dump. There will be a motorcycle cop right around the bend, ready to pounce on them, arguing that they're overloaded. They get a $450, or used to get a $450 ticket, and of course their beat up truck impounded. And you can do that, a policeman who has nothing else to do besides smoking, drinking coffee, and eating donuts, you know, he would have done his job by beating up somebody else and one more entity taking money from the immigrants. There's also the question of whether they were sometimes refused payment. And of course the whole leaf blowing incident that followed one after another, that they were noisy and so forth. The house owners would of course like to have everything done by hand and pay at the same rate, right? So we had little meetings in delicatessens or wherever on the west side, homeowners protesting the fact that gardeners used the lawnmower and they weren't abiding by the law when they lobbied for it and succeeded in getting it. And one of the things that the Latino Gardeners Associated, they took the fight to City Hall. And they went directly to City Hall. Of course, they weren't welcome. So they did a camp out. And they stood there overnight with their tents. I don't recall right now if they were into a hunger strike or not, but they certainly were occupying before that word had the magic that it came to have at least a couple of years ago, demanding that the city council and the mayor, which were not particularly friendly, pay attention to gardeners. You know, what audacity, expecting public officials to care about people doing work, being part of the public. I recall there may have been 2 councilmen who came out and actually visited the campsite right front, you know, where that statue to the most corrupt mayor in the history of corrupt mayors in Los Angeles is. It was, for a while she was at KPFK, and she actually is from a activist.
Jackie Goldberg.
Yeah, Jackie Goldberg. I think the other one was Hernandez. I think he was still in the city council. They went there. The only other person who was willing to talk to them after people interceded with them, I tried. It was not going to have a lot of weight, but Carol and Macias did have a little bit more weight. And finally, the African American councilman paid some attention to these issues. Organizing vulnerable workers like that, and not only saying pay us the minimum, that was not the main issue, give us public recognition and persona and protection, and know that gardeners have the dignity that all workers should have. And that association had its ups and downs, but it certainly was an enterprising, pioneering type of organizing. Later on, people would work with jornaleros, and the success of at least some unions with bringing in large numbers of immigrant workers became more of a rule rather than the non-existence of immigrant workers in some unions. And by the way, some unions are still recalcitrant. But be that as it may, Alvaro brings that kind of background and preoccupation, besides the fact, and I want to come back to where I started, that he's a scholar and an academic, and a very good one, and a sensitive one. He touched on a variety of points, and they zero in on the realities for immigrants. And some of you are appraised of them to a lot or to some extent already, but it's important to understand that you may have an understanding, but many others in the society, including in the Latino community, don't fully fathom what is involved here in terms of lives and, yes, public needs and the public good. We have the so-called immigration debate, and has different parts of it, and no doubt each of us would have different takes on it. We can surmise that immigrants are indispensable to the economy. As easy it is to articulate that phrasing, it is still not there because it is denied so vehemently. Immigrants sustain the economy of the United States. 11 million people, nearly all of them working below the wages that they should receive, with no benefits, with no civic standing, at the mercy of anybody that wants to punish them or rip them off, keep up the standard of living for most of us, and it keeps the government afloat. They're appointing these days and have U.S. government economic czar. One of the great underscorings is the importance of maintaining low interest rates. Some economists would argue that low interest rates, which are so important to the vitality of new businesses, whether small, medium, or large, has to do with what is charged for loan money, stands to reason. And some economies would argue that the low rates are not due to some economics professor that now has a better job. It's the low wages and the productivity. It's not simply low wages, but the productivity of immigrant workers. If you didn't have a stable interest rate, where would you be? To be sure, I counsel you that some would argue that. But the immigrant workforce has a lot to do with the immigrant rate, the interest rate. And of course, what does that have to do with it? It has to do with their productivity and their low wages. You have a whole underclass of people who contribute in any number of ways to public funds or centers of policy application and whatever that receive no benefits at all. Isn't that great? You have a whole sector of people who contribute to these funds who receive no funds from them. In other words, all those that do are in fact living and are receiving that monthly check or that service because these folks aren't getting anything and won't. You know, that's really a masterful architecture of governance. You can keep old Mr. and Mrs. Smith happy by shafting Mr. and Mrs. Sanchez. You can look at certainly Social Security, amongst other things, which of course wants to be abolished, but it doesn't abolish because eventually somebody says, you know, it is soluble. Well, one of the reasons why it is has to do with the contributions of immigrant workers, and that obviously is stable because it maintains the consuming power of the people who receive benefits. And we can go through any series of public funds, as I mentioned a little bit, and where that is a feature. But you also have a population that, of course, has no rights. And you don't need to have a lot of historical imagination to know that that equates slavery. And that sounds alarmist. Well, what else do you have when you have a population whose sole purpose is to work and produce goods and services for others at little or no payment or only sufficient payment so that they can survive to work the next day and for them to survive to grow the next generation of exploited workers who will be in exactly their similar circumstances. A sector that can be despised when you need a target, could be made fun of when you need a little humorous relief, who you can look down on, who clearly does not have your privilege, whether it's of skin or any other kind. They're there doing the menial work, just like you would imagine in the days of Rome and the importance in the sustaining of the Roman Empire due to the work and productivity and other services provided by slaves in those times. They are. Somebody say, well, you can't compare them to, all of a sudden, African Americans are made iconic in regards to their slavery. So you want to wrest away, you want to color over the fact that what you have now is that. And you also see that some of the consequences that befell the slaves of yesterday, and we know what the conditions are of the African American population. Their statistics are as horrifying, second to none only of the Native American, who were the original shafted population. But the conditions of the African American population, you read the statistics and the signs of the statistics. Well, what is happening to the so-called underclass of Hispanics? In other words, the Mexican poor. Are they not following the same trajectory of African Americans? And don't they very strikingly looked at the same way and treated the same way, and they are also de-empowered to an even greater degree. That de-empowering is so important, of course. The issue that Alvaro's beautiful short essays underscores is the fact that immigration is very important. We also notice, as soon as we say that, the fact that it always gets shoved off center stage. Something always happens that keeps the status quo as the status quo. And we face a really wrenching situation. Latinos, and particularly Mexican Americans, who are the largest group, have voted in very large numbers, encouraged. On one hand, we should not forget, because of the kinds of things that governors like Wilson, governors like Neapolitano have done that have so irked even Mexican American middle class that would prefer not to be aroused too much. But they also came out and vote in large numbers because the current occupant of the White House promised all kinds of things. And all you have gotten so far is a stay of execution, a little parole card that only applies to a small sector of the immigrant population, and that in any case is going to expire. And lo and behold, it's going to expire just about the time when the current incumbent of the White House is going to go on to another house. There's clearly a deadlock in Congress. And the roots of that deadlock isn't just simply partisanship. It has to do with a lack of democracy and equality in the United States writ large, which means that the immigration issues that Alvaro highlights really do relate to any number of contradictions within this society. Right? One can think of the fact that we should not tolerate that there are people who live and work with us who have no rights. Yes, they should have some human rights. They should also have ample civil rights. If they're here, if they're living, they're working, they're producing, they're contributing, they're our neighbors, they're our friends, they're our supporters in different endeavors, why shouldn't they have it? What is the big argument? What if we said, well, all the left-handed white women shouldn't have the right to have civil rights? What if we said X-population, maybe all the ones that came from Poland or from Russia shouldn't have rights? Let's stamp them on their hand. Let's stamp them on their forehead. They will not have rights. They can only come here and wash dishes, clean floors, pick up after us, wash our cars, and so on. Well, it's absurd to even bring that up, right? I mean, what kind of argument or rhetoric is that? But what is the situation of large numbers of people without rights? Any kind of rights. Well, you have to solve that. That's a very big contradiction. Somebody who has a progressive bent might want to look, what are the contradictions in this society? Jesus, they're staring you right in the face. You can't deal with the immigrant rights any more than you can deal with the poverty amongst whites, the marginalization and the brutalization of the African American population, without thinking of the fact that you have to rearrange things in a big way. That you have to have democracy and equality for real. That so-called theater of Congress being deadlocked, it's all theatrics. A small group of people representing tiny little islands of the geography of the country, blocking even the most minimal, miserably minimal, moderate reform. And then you look up, how are these districts set up? And who are these people? And how is it that we can talk to a whole bunch of folks in different parts of the country, and they agree with some of our druthers, but these folks, you know, want to have tens of millions of people without health care in the 21st century. They think that's real great. They want to have millions of people in bondage. They want to continue to enjoy government services without paying their fair share of taxes. And the richer they are and the richer they get, the less they want about tax. You got to keep in mind just what it is that people like the Koch brothers, or this lady, 96 years or something like that, from one of the big fortunes of the East Coast. Why is it the Koch brothers invest? That's what they do. They invest millions in electoral politics, and what do they get out of it? This very wealthy person, one of the, her name is instantly recognizable, even though she was not a public figure, but she was very well. You know what this lady did? This lady reported in the LA Times, donated out of her pocket $76 million to anti-immigrant rights activity. That was her contribution to her country and to the future of the present and future next generation. She should be very satisfied wherever she is, and you can imagine where it is that I hope she might be. But there are all kinds of interests like that in play when you see this. I want to remind you about the question of equality and democracy. We don't have equality and we don't have democracy in this country. When are we going to wake up to that? At any level of government. It's not even a joke amongst us how corrupt and how inattentive government. Whether you look at school systems, whether you look at contracts by public agencies, and so forth, it keeps coming across. Just a minute on a book by another writer who also has spent time over there in your northern bailiwick, David Beacon, if I'm pronouncing the name. I certainly have known of his writings for a long time, and I've sourced them. And he has a book on immigration and all the matters with it, which he has entitled "The Right to Stay Home." He calls attention to the fact that you really don't have to have people being driven away from their original homes. If you had a different economy, if you had different government arrangements, why do people have to leave their home to go and get a miserable job? Because if they didn't, they and their family members would literally be destitute. Why indeed? And he refers in an interview in KPFK to a pig slaughtering operation that eventually, possible through NAFTA, of course. To make a long story short, very movingly, there was a small pig slaughtering operation in one part of Veracruz that involved investment and harvesting of pigs on a regional scale. Well, through the new laws, it was possible for large, I won't say American companies, that's kind of passé. Capital doesn't have a nationality, and you're silly. You think that it does, and I know that you're not silly. Simply international. Well, they enlarged it, not 10 times, but a zillion times. Right? So large that what they did was affecting the quality of the land, the quality of the water, the quality of the air, and so forth. The net result was that they lowered the price of pork, and they engineered a tremendous rise in their profits, and what accrued as the bottom line, 120,000 people lost their job in this arena. He also goes on to tell us something that probably everybody in this room knows, and the reason why the Zapatistas did what they did, the way they did it, was that NAFTA almost from one day to the next abolished land holding patterns that had been under assault anyway and were tenuous enough as it is. And 1 million small farmers were put on literally on the road. He also points out in another part how it is that undocumented immigrants that are apprehended are treated in Arizona. In particular, right? That they are chained hand and foot. They are, if the facilities kept in solitary, they are kept from communication with anyone, even though they have the right to do that, whether it's lawyers or their family members. And they are kept in detention indefinitely until, I guess, some 90 or more days. Some little clerk decides that maybe they need room for more prisoners. But what he describes as the treatment in Arizona, not just simply the doings of a psychotic sheriff, but how they are treated as institutional inmates, which serves no purpose. The deporting of people, their detention, their mistreatment, what good does it do? How can Janet Neapolitano come and tell us that somehow she's a public servant that you would want to work under? You know, in a country of 350 million people, there ought to be at least 1,000 that qualify for that job. But it's signifying that we end up with somebody who is both a cop and a warden. So maybe they have plans for you. But it all comes to the fact that we shouldn't tolerate some of the realities that Alvaro, again, use the word beautifully, relates. But we also have to make a better world. If we don't make a better world, it's only going to get a worsened world. And I think that Alvaro's book is a clarion call for us. No, we do have to think about immigrants and immigration, but we can't settle for nothing less than the whole solution. Okay.
We're scheduled until 5, so people have questions.
Your talk brought to mind a article by Jennifer Hochschild where she tries to understand how it is that immigrants or first generation, second generation, third generation come to internalize anti-immigrant views. And since you've been a part of the Chicano community for a long time, I'll speak up, sorry. Since you've been part of the Chicano community for a long time and the Latino community, I'm wondering how you see the mechanisms involved in that kind of internalization. And if it's over time, with the recent election, you see more pro-immigrant attitudes. Because I'm very interested in that, because I think, this is an immigrant country, to the extent that everyone's from somewhere else, so I'm wondering at what generation or what point people internalize those points of view.
Can you repeat the first part?
Yeah, how do people, obviously a lot of immigrants who come over probably have the attitude they're very sympathetic toward other immigrants and immigrants' rights. And then they have children, and I guess their children would be sympathetic. And then they have children, and at which point do these kind of conservative anti-immigrant views, do they internalize these views and accept those, what Laycock calls those frames that are set up? That's a phenomenon. I bet you might have a better understanding of the mechanisms involved in that sort of transition. And historically, are you seeing over time that there's less and less of that? Right.
But no, this is an excellent question. I think part of the problem when we're looking at Mexican immigration is the proximity to the border. So what you see with European immigration, with the Italians and Irish and other groups, over time they were able to be assimilated into this country, and especially after World War II, where with suburbanization, so the discrimination against these groups withered away over time, and because it wasn't being replenished. The problem with Mexican immigration, it continues, and because of the geography, and unfortunately they're a convenient scapegoat. So I'm fearful of the fact that they will always be there when crises arise. When times are good and the economy is doing well, you don't see the same level of hysteria that you find now. During the Great Depression, for example, there was this program called Operation Wetback, where over 1 million Mexicans were deported, both citizens and non-citizens, to Mexico. And that was caused mainly because of the economic crisis. Before that, it wasn't an issue. So unfortunately, with the ebbs and flows of the economy, of capitalism, you will find that in times of crisis, people in power, or middle-class people affected, tend to blame somebody. And in this particular case, it's the the Mexican immigrant that we're talking about here. Obviously, there are other immigrants, Salvadorians, Hondureños, and Guatemaltecos, but because Mexicans are the majority of the group, and because of the proximity to the U.S. border, then they have that unfortunate privilege. What I do say, though, is that, because that's a bleak answer to your question, is that it's incumbent upon us, people that believe in whatever your position is, to do the right thing, to speak out for these individuals, and to organize and to mobilize. Ricardo Flores Magón, for example, 100 years ago, he was writing about these same issues, and he was talking about, not just talking and writing, but he was also organizing. So for me, it's not just a question of theorizing and talking about it with academics and students, but also putting it into practice, in making some type of change, in helping people organize the unorganizable, in helping people realize that we can do more than what we're doing, and we're not in a state of paralysis. We can act upon our beliefs and make a difference. And the youth and the undocumented youth that I talked about in the beginning, I think those are the leaders of this generation.
Do you have any more detailed observations within the Chicano community, the certain generation, adopting immigrant views, like how they come to take on those views? Either of you.
Go ahead.
Oh, it's
For you.
Okay, can you reiterate that?
Just within the Chicano community, is there like a certain generation in which people start to take on anti-immigrant views, like internalize those views, accept those frames? Do you see that happening? And how does that happen?
In terms of within Chicanos internalizing the racism?
Yeah, and internalizing the anti-immigrant.
No, I think that's an excellent question. I think part of the internalization occurs where people of Mexican descent feel shameful of their status, and they end up, for example, they will call other Mexicans like Tijuanero or TJ. They'll use a prerogative term to refer to each other. But part of it is internalizing, but the other part is to separate yourself, right? So like, I'm American and you're from TJ, so you're one of them. They're not talking about me. This is part of the internalizing this racism, and in the same way that we see, with African Americans, some African Americans internalizing the racism and trying to separate themselves, from other groups, right? We see this with Ward Connerly and people of that stripe. But unfortunately, there's going to be a lot of people that want to feel and believe that they're Americans, and which they are, but because a segment of their group are being treated unfairly or being blamed for things, they want to separate themselves. And I think that only comes about by raising consciousness and awareness. And then there's some people you just unfortunately can't help.
Hi. Can you wait for the microphone? Hang on, let me just pass. Can you pass this back so I can set that up?
Hi, my name is Amelia. I'm on this campus building for premiere, for film screening, BA Speaks Revolution, Nothing Less, at the Nev Auditorium on the 17th. And I thought some of your presentation of you're describing the Republicans, all these Tea Party forces, and actually BA has this quote that says, conservatives my ass, these people are Nazis. And I thought a lot of your presentation actually, on the one hand, it's the negative polarization that exists, where on the one hand you're saying, we don't want in on this, but then on the other hand you said, well, if they treat us a little better, maybe we do want in on this. And I think this, which I think is what some of what Juan Gómez-Quiñones was talking about, this is a system that from genocide to slavery to those 2 million people who've been deported, it is a question, the question needs to be asked, how long must we continue to live in a system of exploitation, oppression, brutality? And so I don't know if you've thought of that, because I just think, some of what you were walking through is sort of what is out there throughout society, and people, being pulled and swayed without a clear sense of what's the problem and what's the solution.
Well, that's an excellent question. For me, it doesn't really matter where I'm at. There's a lot of people that feel like they're American and they're proud of it, or they're exceptional. this idea of exceptionalism, I really don't feel anything. The fact that I was born here is an accident. It wasn't any, I had no control over it. If I'm here or in Mexico, I would be saying the same thing. So for me, it's not about, buying into a system. It's about demanding that people treat other people with respect and dignity. And it's not even to educate certain people, because some people are just bullies, and that's how they behave. So it's more about standing up for people that can't speak up for themselves. So I'm indifferent in terms of my legal status here. It doesn't affect me, or I don't feel any privilege or feel like I have to defend the country or not defend it. I don't believe in the nationalism in that regard. What I do believe is wherever I am or wherever anybody's at, where there's an injustice, that we need to act upon it and do something about it. The first responsibility is speaking out about it, and the second thing is to act on it, obviously, in terms of organizing. So that's how I feel about it.
I have a solution. Excuse me. Part of your presentation was that blacks and Latins are kind of like going down the same path, and I concur with that assessment. I was born in South Central, but I lived in Hawaii for 10 years. And the Asians in Hawaii face the same conservative racism from the contract people like Dole Pineapple that brought them there to be farmers for the sugarcane and pineapple. But to transcend this behavior, they created inclusive socioeconomic behaviors that they all had a name for. The Japanese called it a Tanamoshi, the Koreans a K, the most popular is the Chinese Hui. Anyway, and yesterday you had over 200 congressional people, mostly Latin laborers and immigrant advocates, chanting "Si se puede" and getting arrested. And I suggest, how more effective could they be if they would also empower people with a more inclusive socioeconomic behavior? If you look at Asians, and I'll kind of stop here with this, and I'd like to meet with you all private on this. Poverty for Asians is at 12%, which is less than the national average. For blacks, Latins, and Native Americans, it's 30% plus. So what's the difference? Except that these people have internalized this relative exclusive socioeconomic behavior, and these people are transcending it. So maybe we need to mimic this model.
Like I need a backup. It's like the lucha libre.
You answer it.
The blue demon, El Santo.
It's a hard question.
I forgot what the question was.
It wasn't a question.
Excuse me?
It wasn't a question. I said there's a solution that you're not looking at.
Right.
Expanding the behavior beyond self to more inclusive social.
Well, I think in general we have to be open and look at different people and get what we can get from them and learn from other people's successes. I think what's clear, what's never been acknowledged is that Mexicans in particular have been resisting this injustice from day one. Mexicans have been organizing, from day one for a better reality, since the beginning of time, from the conquest to the present. And where there's better examples that we can draw from, I think that's something that we can appreciate. But in terms of getting ahead and doing more for people, it has to do with the fact that there is commonalities among working people, among poor people, where that's where the organizing should be. Not necessarily just because you're Mexican that we're going to be on the same footing. For example, you have many of the Latino politicians that are supporting this border enforcement bill. So what good is to elect Latino officials that are going to mimic the same thing that the white officials or elected officials are going to do? So in my book, I prefer to have a white politician that's going to be parodying that type of racist, anti-immigrant policy than have somebody like a wolf in sheep's clothing.
Yeah, I mean, both of you brought up this question of the experience of Latino immigrants and black people, and I'm sure you saw the movie The Help.
Yes, yes.
And the question of, you raised this question of Jim Crow and the fact that it was dismantled through tremendous struggle and sacrifices of the 50s civil rights movement. And I would add the 60s black liberation struggle and, kind of revolutionary upsurge of that period. And now we have a situation where black people have formal equality in terms of dismantling Jim Crow, but now we have the new Jim Crow, which was written by Michelle Alexander with mass incarceration, war on drugs, all this stuff that's locking up over 2 million black and Latino youth. And I guess I have a question about kind of, isn't this an indictment of the system in the United States, the US capitalist imperialist system, that black people, Latinos are going through what black people went through already,
Right.
which was the hardest working group in America. They worked for free for over hundreds of years, from sunup to sundown, and now there was the migration to the north, and then what, Dr. Gómez-Quiñones described about the situation today, And to me, this situation right now, it raises the question of legitimacy of such a system, that does this to groups and groups and groups of people down through the generations, and her question about how many more generations are going to have to go through this.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like this moment right now, I beg to differ. I think it's actually, we need to look at, it's not just theatrics. This is a very dangerous, I think it's a moment befraught with danger. The shutdown, the showdown between these people who are really fanatics, okay? The Tea Party people are lunatics, fanatics, fascists, okay? And then these Democrats who, I don't know, in terms of historical analogy and some of what you write about, in your book, which I like to get, in terms of these kind of questions have circulated through different nations in history, including in Germany, of like the struggle between the Weimar Republic and the Nazis, of the Nazis feeling the Weimar Republic couldn't really run things, they were too soft. So we got to look at kind of like these clashes and then the moment, and then in terms of, one of the quotes on the film is that those people who are the outcasts and the downcast, which you spoke about as well, there's the good immigrants and then the bad immigrants, those people on the bottom are the bad immigrants, and those people need to become not just liberators of themselves, but emancipators of all humanity. And I guess my question is this, dare we dream those dreams, of getting out of this kind of world, this kind of society? And I thought Dr. Gómez-Quiñones also alluded to that at the end of kind of like, do we just have our vision and our framework and our parameters just on what is and the suffering all around the world, or do we dare to break out? And I want to kind of conclude by seconding, this thing of, I call, really encourage everybody to go to this film, Revolution Nothing Less, BA Speaks, which is on the 17th at Deneuve, and we have flyers here.
No, but definitely, the issue is not a question about Republicans and Democrats, it's a systemic issue, right? So it's a question about capitalism and the inherent contradictions within capitalism. So that's something that will not change because you have a black man as a president or a woman being elected as the Fed. This is something that that is inherent. And then also crisis is inherent in capitalism. So if you look at the economic history of the United States during the last 200 years, you can see on the graph, the ebbs and flows of in terms of the crisis, right? And during those times, that's when the harshest laws and take place against those on the bottom, very vulnerable. And it's very convenient for them, right? So instead of white working class people in Appalachia blaming their employers or the government for their own status, it's easy to blame the Mexican, and before that they were blaming the black that just came, just migrated from the south to the north. So this is just part of it's a systemic problem. Okay, we have 8 more minutes, 7 minutes, people. Any other questions, comments? Not all at once.
I have a question about the framing, because when you were talking about how the Republicans do a better job, and I asked, well, why is it that they're so good at it, and who's doing it for them? And you talked about how there's money being pumped.
Right.
So there's definitely funds for that, but what exactly is missing in that narrative to counter the Republican narrative, to tell that story in a better way, in a more effective way?
Well, the Republicans have had an advantage because of the their access to capital. And so they've been able to invest over the years millions and millions of dollars in setting up these think tanks, like the Heritage Foundation, American Enterprise, so that they just exclusively think and write about policy, and they have the talking points for the elected officials. In order to counter that, you would need the same level of capital, the same level of influence to match that. You have Soros, for example, a billionaire who's a progressive, who does some of that to counter with progressive groups. But in order to be at that level, you need to match it, in terms of the capital. Without that, then you need people to organize and to, at the grassroots level, to combat that, or at least to be able to give the counter argument, right? And for people like myself and others that think this way, is to not confuse Democrats, elected officials, with progressives or people that are socially conscious, right? Because elected officials, Democrats, are particularly interested in their own self-interest in terms of getting elected and re-elected, whether you're Latino or not. So if that's your agenda, if that's what you think the solution lies, then you're just going to pay for a mayor, or vote for a mayor that's going to take another position at Herbalife, or is going to be representing a bank, or is going to be working for a consulting agency. I mean, is this what it has come down to, in terms of making public policy a difference, in terms of the ballot, and in falsely thinking that that's the way to go? I think at the end of the day, it's about young people from universities like UCLA to write these books and to speak up and to organize and make a difference at the grassroots level. Because in terms of matching tit for tat in terms of capital, I don't think that's feasible, considering like the Koch brothers and other people that invest millions and millions of dollars. Do we have time for like one more question? Come on, people. No more questions? Okay, well, I guess we'll leave it at that. I'd like to thank everybody. And we have, I think UCLA store right there. So we have my book for sale, $16.95 in the back. And there's a special today, actually, is for two, is $34. And we accept food stamps and recycling bottles and whatever you have, brewing card. And this is an excellent book by George Lakoff that I was talking about. It's only like $9, and this is it's like a commercial. This is brought to you by. This is Juan Gómez-Quiñones' incredible book about defense of the indigenous communities, and not just in terms of people, but their philosophies and their way of thinking, and how they're more advanced than the European way of thinking and Eurocentric way of the world, in terms of making a difference in a more sustainable way of living, and not just in now, but for future generations. So with that, I'd like to thank everybody for sticking around. I know it's a long 2 hours. And this is a great opportunity for me as well to be here with all you. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
So I guess you can purchase the book over there, and then we can